Peace building, peace building. The former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, called the Department of Defense the largest, most complex organization on the planet. This powerful level, cabinet level bureaucracy, which before 1947 was called the Department of War, has dominated our relationships with most of the planet. My talk today advocates for creating a Department of Peacebuilding, and that's what House Resolution 1111 would do. It's a bill that last August was introduced, was a part of our American Ethical Union assembly, and we as a community voted to support it. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. First, I'm going to share some personal connections to the cultures of war and peace, from my childhood to my work in peace education. And then second, I'll describe some of the reasons to support a Department of Peace. And I'll conclude by pointing out how peace building can manifest in diverse ways, from business strategies to personal spiritual growth. I'm just going to touch on this today. I can't do it all. It's such a broad topic. But first, I'll talk about the fact that I was raised in war culture. I was taught that war was a given in life, even a good thing. I mean, I loved toy weapons, like my Johnny 7, a plastic machine gun, which the advertisement said, quote, killed in 7 ways. My friends and I would play war all over the neighborhood, and we particularly liked feigning death, dramatically flinging ourselves to the ground after being shot. I had a big collection of G.I. Joes. As I grew older, I moved on to board games about war, like Stratego, like Risk and Battle Cry, Dogfight. One of my favorites was Broadside. I loved movies about war, The Great Escape, The Dirty Dozen, the Guns of Navarone. And I'm pretty sure that my immersion in war culture is partially why, as a preteen, I saw nothing wrong about early US actions in Vietnam. I began to appreciate the horror of it when I saw the names of those killed scrolling up on the TV screen at the end of the nightly news. And I saw protests in college towns where I lived, in New Haven, in Berkeley, California. In 1970, I went to an anti-war rally that began to clarify for me the absurdity of war culture. And it's one reason why a decade later, in 1980, I found myself teaching peace activism to 8th graders at St. Albans School. I joined Educators for Social Responsibility, and with them I co-authored a nationally distributed peace curriculum. I organized a juggle fest for nuclear freeze. It was a creative but poorly attended protest against nuclear weapons. And thanks to a visit from a congressman that I once worked for, I got on ABC radio and I explained to the reporter, as in juggling, so too with nuclear bombs. No matter how good you are, if you keep at it, you're liable to drop one. In 1984, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists declared that the world was closer to nuclear disaster than it had been for 2 decades. The Reagan administration was antagonizing the USSR, accelerating the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Defense Department budget swelled. Militarism was on full display in Grenada and Libya and Nicaragua. Public anxiety about war culture was growing, which is why I invited anti-nuclear activist Theo Brown, who was executive director of Ground Zero, to debate the General Counsel of the Department of Defense in the Reagan administration. I was able to secure this high-level administration official because he was my cousin, Will. Will Taft was a humble, reasonable, hardworking public servant who I respect. So I found it hard to blame him for an administration I abhorred. Was I wrong to give Will the opportunity to defend peace through strength, which at the time was the leading euphemism for a culture of war and violence? Thankfully, in his second term, President Reagan moderated a bit. He and Gorbachev reached a landmark intermediate range nuclear forces agreement. and he established the foundation for the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. But while some credit Reagan for ending the Cold War, it's clear to me that he grew the Defense Department and continued our history of militarism. During the transition from the Reagan to the Bush administration, my cousin Will became acting Secretary of Defense for a few months. And two of our ancestors held the same position. Kind of weird. Our grandfather, William Taft, served as Secretary of War for Teddy Roosevelt, and our great-great-grandfather, Alphonso Taft, served as Secretary of War for Ulysses Grant. And though I believe all three displayed dedication and integrity and a commitment to trying to make the world safer, all three were inside a bureaucracy perpetuating our culture of war. Now, independent of my family legacy, I've fed our addiction to militarism because every year I pay my taxes that buy deadly weapons. I bring this up because both participating in war culture and having relatives so integral to militarism weighs on me. Why have I not done more? Unlike many Revolutionary era Quakers, for example, I've paid no price for objecting to war. I haven't been jailed like Thoreau was, who refused to pay his taxes to fund the war with Mexico. I haven't organized tax resistance, as did one of my heroes, A.J. Muste, in 1965, when he got hundreds of famous people like Joan Baez, Dorothy Day, Noam Chomsky to pledge not to pay their taxes in protest of Vietnam. No, I just continue to pay my taxes. Maybe it's time I stopped. I mean, I did try to teach my students about thoughtful resistance to the culture of war. I urged back then, and I still do, rethinking how to resolve conflicts. I've spoken out about how peacebuilding includes protection of our beautiful biosphere, this thin membrane of life sandwiched between the rock that is our home and the rest of the universe. But there's so much more I could do, a lot more we could do. That's one reason I support H.R. 1111, because if passed, it would create a federal level Department of Peacebuilding. Now, some folks have pointed out that there's already a U.S. Institute of Peace housed in a beautiful building with a roof line meant to seem a bit like dove's wings. Since 1984, its mission has been to offer the widest possible range of education and training and basics in applied research and peace information services. And every time I drive by that building, which is just north of the Lincoln Memorial, I'm reminded of how important it is to work for peace, because it educates the public, nonprofits, and the rest of government about peace building, often through partnerships with the Defense Department. Thanks, Drew. You can take that down. So if we have a Peace Institute, do we need a Department of Peacebuilding? Well, I think if you look at the numbers, we do. Last year, the U.S. Institute of Peace's budget was $38 million, but the DoD's budget was $714 billion. The DoD's budget is about 18,000 times larger than the Institute of Peace budget. How could the Institute possibly influence this bureaucratic military behemoth? Whether it grows out of the Institute of Peace or as a new organization, we need a cabinet-level peace-building agency with a lot more financial and human resources. I mean, it's not like the United States always had a large military, like it's a given. In 1890, the United States had one of the smallest armies of any major power, under 40,000 men. France, in comparison, at that time, had an army of over 500,000. But as America became an imperialist power, funding grew, especially during wartime. I mean, in 1900, defense spending in the US was about 1% of our GDP, surging to 22% in World War I, 41% in World War II. During the Cold War, it was about 10%, and since then it's gone up and down between 5% and 2.6%, where it sits today. Now, 2.6% may seem small, but our GDP is so large that the United States spends more on national defense than, ready, China, India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Brazil combined. Many estimate that half of our discretionary spending is military related. Nearly 3 million people are employed by the Department of Defense, and it operates 4,800 sites in over 160 countries. But the biggest problem with the Department of Defense, in my opinion, is not its size, but its mission, which is to provide the military forces the Pentagon says it needs to deter war and protect the United States. I'm all for deterring war and for our security, but the means identified in its mission are extraordinarily narrow to provide military forces, period. Well, you know the expression, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If what we mainly have are military forces, we'll think that peace requires military intervention. So no wonder we stumble in and out of military conflicts like the one in Afghanistan. We need a lot more tools in our toolbox. Now, a different metaphor is used by Wendy Green, a longtime advocate for the Department of Peace. She prefers a medical metaphor. In a podcast, World Spirituality, Green said that at times we need a surgeon. That's true. But that health is best maintained through a healthy lifestyle and preventative medicine. Fresh foods, exercise, sleep, and careful use of medication can help avoid the more dangerous and expensive surgical intervention. Green says that we're too reactive. As a nation, we wait for violence and then respond with violence. She argues that obviously we need to avoid violence before it can cause harm. Waiting for violence and then reacting violently is an eye for an eye strategy. As Gandhi said, that'll leave the whole world blind. We need more preventative tools like diplomacy. Now, you know that the government agency most responsible for diplomacy is the Department of State, but next year the State Department will only receive about $58 billion, less than 1/12 of the DoD budget. It's pretty clear that if people are safe and have economic opportunities, they're less likely to go to war as well. But we dedicate relatively little to foreign development and security aid. According to the Brookings Institute, less than 1% of our budget goes to foreign aid, about $39 billion. That's about 18 times smaller than the DoD budget. That's all Fed aid from overseas. We just spend way too much on dealing with the results of violence and too little on peaceful strategies. And President Obama's Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, knew this was a problem. Back in 2007, Gates explained, quote, "We must focus our energies beyond the guns and steel of the military, beyond just our brave soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen." In a speech to Kansas State University, Gates promoted more funding and resources to develop soft power tools like diplomacy, economic aid, and technical assistance. And Gates even put his money where his mouth was by redirecting some DoD funds into the State Department, his own money. Now, I'm not sure how successful President Biden's going to be in nurturing a culture of peace. I'm glad that when he justified withdrawing from Afghanistan, he said that, quote, "Human rights will be at the center of our foreign policy." And he continued, he said, "But the way we do it is not through endless military deployments, but through diplomacy, economic tools, and rallying the rest of the world for support," end quote. But that skepticism about what any politician today can do is because the culture of war is so strong in this country. There's such resistance by those who reap outrageous profits from the military-industrial complex. They push back hard. So maybe a more radical approach is necessary. And one idea is to reinvent the Department of Defense. Reinvent what the retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel William Astor suggested as a way to deal with the DoD's bloated budget and sprawling interventionism. Astor cited Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex and condemned America's role in international arms trading. We're one of the leaders. And he says that doesn't protect us. What Astor suggested is that we, quote, need a new people's military that could truly defend the American Republic, focused above all on supporting the Constitution, freedom of speech, the press, and assembly, the right to privacy and due process, justice for all. I think that would be nice, but I'm not so sure the DoD can be reinvented. Bureaucracies are hard to change. So I support H.R. 1111 and the Department of Peacebuilding for that reason. And I'm so glad the American Ethical Union passed the resolution on renewal of a commitment to a culture of peace. The resolution is part of the AU's long history in supporting a culture of peace and establishing a federal level department to address the root causes of violence and war. And the resolution pointed out how peacebuilding must be comprehensive, including dealing with systemic racism, economic injustice, climate change. Through that resolution, we are asking all of us to recommit to peace on all levels and in every aspect of our lives. The current campaign for a cabinet-level department began in July of 2001 when the legislation was introduced to Congress again. Other nations are currently supporting these types of measures, by the way. Over the past century, an entire academic field of peacebuilding has focused on practical methods of conflict prevention, nonviolent intervention, mediation. These are academically sound areas of study. And peacebuilding is not just a tool for international affairs. A Department of Peacebuilding would address personal and family violence, including suicide and addiction, while working to heal social wounds. It would address the youth homicide rate in the US, which is 10 times higher than any other industrialized nation. It would do real work to improve American lives. Wendy Green, who I mentioned before, said that 85% of the funding in a Department of Peacebuilding is designated to preventing violence in the United States. At a Department of Peacebuilding would also celebrate days designated to peace, like the United Nations International Day of Peace, which happens every September 21st. The reason why I'm talking about this today. A cabinet-level department would nurture peace at every level, personal, local, regional, national, and global. Drew, would you put up in the chat the two Peace Day Philly and HR 111 links, and you can email me if you'd like to get those live links. So for the final part of my talk, I want to emphasize that the breadth of work that a Department of Peacebuilding would support is huge. And I'll do so just by examining two pretty very different areas of peace work: entrepreneurial work in the business community and inner spiritual work. One section of HR 1111 steers peacebuilding towards entrepreneurship. It calls on, quote, the experience and expertise of individuals and seek participation in the development of policy from private, public, and non-governmental organizations. And it's one of the few places in the bill where the private sector is called in, but I think it's crucial, and I thought it was so intriguing I wanted to share it today, because the business community's got to be behind this. And I think it's easier to involve them than you might imagine. I learned this from a friend, Sheldon Himmelfarb, who's worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace and is now the CEO of Peace Tech Lab. Peace Tech's a private sector enterprise dedicated to using technology and media in innovative ways to stop violence. Sheldon works to amplify technology to do good and save lives. And he pointed out that these technologies are already being used by violent extremists to kill and terrorize. They were used in Arab Spring by progressive forces. So governments and NGOs need to work with the private sector to invest in the peaceful application of technology. And Sheldon advocates finding creative ways to do this, where private funds can invest in conflict zones to empower those most in danger. Because even in crisis regions, technology with the potential to keep people safe, like cell phones, is widely available now. It's very different. So Sheldon shared 3 examples, actually more, but I'll share 3 with you. With Peace Tech's help, Haiti's Louina Robillard developed a program to install solar street lights to help minimize gang violence and rapes in Haiti. Dishad Othman, who lived in Syria, created a texting app which sends warnings to people to seek shelter to avoid being killed, whether by mobs or drones. And Rachel Brown developed a program that sends carefully worded, timed messages to de-escalate violence in Kenya. While I've just started to learn about peace tech, what's really exciting about this approach is that in building peace, you can also build up the economies. Peace business can attract young people into constructive work. They offer an alternative path, particularly for young men so often lured into civil wars by greedy megalomaniacs. Local residents and foreign investors are partnering in peace entrepreneurship. Sheldon even mentioned that Marriott, the mega corporation, is planning to build Hutu hotels in Haiti and Rwanda, both recently no-go zones for investments. So from the concrete and practical world of technology and business, let me turn to the inner work necessary to nurture a sustainable culture of peace. Some call it spiritual work. Now, both terms, spirituality and culture of peace, are nebulous. According to the UN, a culture of peace is a set of values, attitudes, traditions, modes of behavior, and ways of life that reject violence and prevent conflicts by tackling their root causes to solve problems through dialogue and negotiation among individuals, groups, and nations. Working to nurture inner peace is about affecting values and attitudes of people. And some people like the term spiritual work, while others prefer more secular descriptions like mindfulness practice or psychological counseling or social counseling. Whatever you call it, most of this kind of inner work nurtures a greater sense of connection to other people and to all life. It encourages a deep shift in consciousness. And this shift of consciousness is at the heart of Ethical Culture's NGO at the United Nations, National Ethical Service. We'll hear more about this later, but it's amazing that many of ethical societies are not familiar with NES. Its purpose is to promote a consciousness shift towards our comprehensive interconnectedness as we affirm our identity in ethical culture. The mission continues. We celebrate the transcendent possibility in ethical culture through the practice of ethical behavior and joyful engagement in community life. We see ourselves as change agents who connect with emerging collective determined to bring about the evolution of consciousness. Now, I know some of you will easily embrace this description and others will find it obtuse and vague. We do need more dialogue to assure that our different language does not get in our way of our shared work, which is urgent. One group that advocates for a deep shift in consciousness along with the NES is the Peace Alliance. Wendy Green, who worked at the Peace Alliance for years, spoke of peace activism as advanced spiritual work. For her, such work is facilitated by deeper appreciation for the oneness of everyone. And such an appreciation affects how she works with others. She tries to care about the needs of others as much as she cares about her own needs. It changes how she views herself, her very identity, in trying to be the change she was trying to bring about. She engages in political activism with a greater equanimity and love, especially, she added, when it's mixed with a healthy portion of humility and humor. I'll add something that may seem both obvious and contentious. Discussions about this inner work necessary for a culture of peace seem to be more commonly embraced by women. This was reinforced by an episode of the Peacebuilding podcast I just listened to, hosted by Susan Coleman, who's taught collaborative strategies for 30 years. Her guest, therapist Terry Real, agreed that a major roadblock to building a culture of peace is patriarchy, a mode of interaction based on domination, taught to boys and girls. They spoke of how patriarchy is too often taught as a superior approach to life. We're told to be invincible, be number one, win at all costs. And this paradigm has proved unsustainable. Terry Real goes so far as to say, quote, "We will move beyond patriarchy or we will die." Real cites Carol Gilligan's research indicating that women are more generally able to adopt ecological collaborative models that assume a win-win paradigm. The drive to control and dominate inherent in win-lose paradigms has led to massive misalignment with each other and with nature. Patriarchy's addiction to power over and its resistance to power with has led us down a path of destruction. So is it a surprise that our own National Ethical Service grew out of the National Women's Conference formed in 1924 by women at local ethical societies? Is it a surprise that National Ethical Service has been fueled by a lot of incredible women? Recently, I've been taught about peace building primarily by women, such as ethical culture leader Martha Gallagher, who first told me about a culture of peace. I remember a retreat where we connected the term culture of peace with what the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, called the ethical manifold. Now, here's how I explain that odd term. Imagine that every person in the world has managed to nurture the most positive relationship possible with all other persons, each relationship bringing out the best in others. That web of optimized and ideal relationships, I think, is what Adler meant by the ethical manifold. Now, personally, I think we should be a little less species-centric, and that we should include in the manifold all living things, which many do, and point to Adler sometimes in implying that. So imagine, if you will, a world where all life is supported and sustained so it would bring out the best of all life. That's a model promoted by Dot Maver, one of the leading teachers of peace. So let me conclude by referring to an article Maver wrote back in 2013 entitled, "A Culture of Peace Emerges." For those like myself who sometimes find it hard to imagine a culture of peace, or who are stuck in a life of a culture of war, Maver offers this useful reminder. She says, quote, "Peace systems already exist. The best example is Mother Nature and the dynamic principles of cooperation and interdependence she demonstrates." A culture of peace is not some complex constructed ideal. It may be hard to replicate in human relations, but the natural world gives us an example of an amazingly collaborative system. In that article, Maver emphasizes the collaboration within the peace movement. And she sort of speaks to us today. She says, reading this is part of a peace system. That is, you are a part of a synergistic effort to make the world a better place, knowing that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Each one of us has our own unique contribution to the system. Ethical culture emphasizes the uniqueness of individuals. We pledge to respect the unique worth of each and every person. People are different. That's why conflict occurs. But as in nature, difference also contributes to the healthy functioning of the whole. But we have to work on it. Maver stresses that peace is not a passive state. The National Peace Academy, where she teaches, stresses that peace is the wholeness created by right relationships with oneself, other persons, other cultures, other life, Earth, and the larger whole of which we are all a part. Given the many reasons for pessimism these days, pandemics, climate change, systemic racism, the politics of hate, restrictive laws about control of one's body. Maver's optimism is refreshing. She exudes positivity. She says, our worldview is literally shifting. It is as if we are taking off the pair of glasses which we have used to see the world through one of competition, separation, individualization, and replacing them with a new pair through which we can see the world as one of cooperation, unity, interdependence, group work, and sharing on the behalf of the common good. To build peace, we have to see all areas of human activity through the lens of peace building. In inner work, personal relations, business, and the structures of government. And we can do this better if we have a well-resourced cabinet-level department that takes this work seriously. I'll conclude with a final quote by Maver. And if you find the term spirituality off-putting, I get that. Try replacing it with humanness. I'll do that, actually. She said, I submit that we are waking up to the fact that our essential spirituality, we're waking up to the fact of our essential humanness. As the human family takes shared responsibility beyond our material satisfaction, we will experience a cultural renaissance beyond our wildest dreams. So let's keep the wild dream of peace alive. Support Peace Day events this coming Tuesday. Support National Ethical Service. And tell your representatives to support HR 1111. Let's create a Department of Peacebuilding. Thanks a lot.